Personal products are a great way to complement your commercial work. It allows you to take the opportunity to showcase your style, your passions, and your unique point of view. But where do you start? And how do you make sure you actually finish it? Hey, what's up? I'm Joachim, and welcome back to the channel. Back in 2024, I released a motion design piece called Sights Unseen that tells the story about seeing the unseen through the lens of skateboarding. So today's video is going to be a complete breakdown of this project. I'll cover everything that went into it, what the creative process looked like, and all the mistakes and learnings I made along the way. Last but not least, we'll jump into Houdini, where I'll walk you through some of the working files. If you haven't watched the short, I highly recommend you do so first, and I'll make sure to leave a link to that in the description of this video. So with that said, let's dive in. All right, welcome to the other side. The whole premise of the short was that I wanted to try and show how skaters naturally see the world in a different way. So I think, let me just pull up the short and I'll talk you through the thinking and rationale that went on behind each scene, and that way you can get a better understanding for everything. So in the beginning, we're opening up on these warmly lit shots of surfaces and other objects that seemingly seems pretty mundane. But this whole section is supposed to speak to that moment of realization when you start to notice your own surroundings and when you start to pay attention to these potential skate spots. And in terms of camera, I'm keeping the camera language very simple and slow here in the beginning. And I'm doing this for two reasons. And the first one being that it kind of fits thematically to this whole feeling of being in a state of wonder and being in a discovery phase. But secondly, it also allows me to build tension throughout the film. And I think this ties into how I approach the lensing as well. So, for example, in this first shot, we open up on this narrow lens, and then gradually we're opening up again to a more wider lens. And I do a little bit of repetition here, but that was sort of the thinking behind that. And, you know, I could have opened up on more of a wider establishing shot here, but I just found it a little bit more interesting if we don't really see too much of the context in the beginning. And I kind of wanted the audience to experience it throughout the film instead. And also in regards to lensing, we're cutting in on this shot of this schoolyard. And then I cut in between to a more narrower lens that focuses in on this school bench. So all of these decisions serve that purpose and that intention of, trying to convey that message of discovery. I'm also using lighting as a way to emphasize that morning vibe. But not only that, I'm also using lighting as a narrative tool. So for example, in this shot, we can see these shadows of people just walking by and, they're just minding their own business. But we as the audience are locked in on this fire hydrant. So then again, just trying to reinforce that idea of skaters seeing the world in a different way. So the film progresses, but then there's a sudden shift in tone. And the camera is still moving at the same tempo, but the lighting has changed into something darker and more eerie. And this is where I introduce the barriers or the obstacles. And I thought it was kind of interesting how, for regular people, a staircase might be a challenge in terms of getting from A to B. But for skaters, that might be the opportunity. And the real obstacles are actually the things that hinders us from being able to skate. So, things like skate stoppers, cracks, and the gravel on the ground, for example. So again, just trying to reinforce that message of how skaters see the world differently. And as the film progresses, for music and sound design, we kind of reach this point of no return. So gravel blows away and cracks fill in themselves and skate stoppers pop off from the benches. And, we're just in for the ride, really. And then from here, it's all about the innovation and how, we can imagine different spots and different shapes and forms and how that transpires into more inspiration and creativity. So we have some ledges that kind of do the same thing. They kind of self-evolve and reform and reshape into different compositions and forms. There used to be this term that kind of evolved over time where you would do multiple tricks on a single grind. And that kind of became known as ledge dancing, which I thought was kind of weird and funny. So when I animated this, I just put on some dance tracks and then I kind of animated it to that. So that's kind of why they behave in this way. Technically, this section here is kind of simple, really. It's just blocks of cubes and simple shapes and with some simple animation and some fast-paced editing. And I think that's something worth keeping in mind as well, that you don't have to go overboard with your animation. It can often be forgotten in the process. We're so focused on the whole 3D aspect and building out our scenes and doing animation and all that stuff. But there's a lot of cheap tricks that you can do in editing that can have a greater impact than some super intricate animation. I think there's this universal experience among street skaters where you're obviously always looking for new opportunities to skate. But there's also this other side of it where it's almost like this creative force, and instead of merely seeking out opportunities, there's a tendency to reimagine or reinvent or create your own opportunities. So that was kind of some of the reasoning and thinking that went behind this bench shot here. So the benches get pulled together and form a new composition, and thus creating a new spot to skate. Another thing worth mentioning is that I'm using a lot of secondary animation on pre-existing animations. So for example, on this shot, we have this metal plate that kicks up some dust, and then we have some leaves flying in the wind from these pole jams, and we got some dust and gravel shooting up from the ground. And sometimes I think little goes far. So for example, on these shots, it's pretty subtle, and it's not really designed to be an effect for the sake of it being an effect. It's more as a way to help reinforce pre-existing motion. But I find as you're working throughout your edit and locking in your shots, details like this can help elevate a shot as a whole. And we'll get into some of these working files, and so you can see how I made it. But thought I'd mention that because I think that's a pretty good tip as well. So while we're on this bench, there's actually a little bit of a mini story behind this. So this bench is known as the Ave bench, and that's from a professional skater. But some skaters stole it from somewhere and put it in this downtown LA plaza. And then throughout time and throughout skate films, it kind of became famous. At some point, a group of skaters from New York just shoved it in a U-Haul and drove it across country. So that's kind of why this bench is moving from places to places. It goes from LA to New York. This is supposed to be Thompson Park, I believe. So it lived there for a while. But then another group of skaters took it and shipped it to Philadelphia. So it kind of have this mini road trip story behind it, which I thought was really funny. There's a little Easter egg here. So if you notice here, there's this poster, and this is inspired by an actual poster that someone in the skate community created. The regular person might not even get that reference or understand, but for the people who do, it kind of adds another level to it, just in terms of the way you connect with it. And I think that's a tip for sure, to think about ways that you can bring your audience in on a deeper level, even if it's just a part of your audience. And a director who's really good at this, not necessarily Easter eggs, but just in terms of putting visual detail into a frame or a shot or a scene and letting the viewer discover it as the film progresses, is Terrence Malick. His films are very poetic and artsy kind of, but I find that it's just crazy how you can watch the same movie over and over again and discover new things every time you rewatch it. And I even think that this ended up on the local news in New York at some point. So I think it just goes to show how the culture behind street skating in general can ripple through and even reach beyond the skate culture itself. And that's kind of why we have this ripple that goes through here. And then from this ripple, there's this wave that forms, and that was as a way to nod at the origins of street skating. So bringing it from surfing and taking it to the streets. And then this wave crashes, and as you dig deeper, you might find yourself at places that you never would have found yourself otherwise. And then I'm taking a bit of inspiration from skateboard filming here. So there's this technique where you would film a skater doing a line, and the line is when you're doing multiple tricks consecutively in a single sequence. So you would end the sequence by filming the ground, and then on the following shot, you would start that sequence by pointing the camera at the ground and then pull up. So that way you would have this transition that moves through. So that was the inspiration behind this transition. Another little skate story that you wouldn't know about unless you're in the space is that the reason why this particular spot is in the film is because there's this professional skater, Sami Baka, and he revisited this spot, I think 72 times or something, and he doesn't have a car, and he lives in Las Vegas, so he has to take a megabus from Las Vegas to LA, where the spot is at, 72 times just to make the single trick. And as I was moving through this project, I just found that story very inspiring, just in terms of the perseverance and the commitment and the passion and the obsession that often comes with skateboarding. So I thought that this spot deserved a space in this short. So we fall down this rabbit hole of a spiral staircase, and then we come out to what I call the ender section. And an ender in skateboarding is considered the last trick of your part when you're filming a skate part. And most often than not, it involves the most difficult trick or the scariest trick. And there's a lot of staircases and stuff that have been enders. So I figured that the last section would be all stairs. This shot here is a direct reference to the Macba 4, a famous spot in Barcelona. It's not a 4-star anymore, but whatever. And these pieces are sort of forming together and forming the staircase, and then the staircase explodes. And I just thought about how certain spots have this ability to bring skaters together to one single location. And through that, certain spots kind of get this legendary status around them. A lot of these spots have changed throughout time, and some don't exist anymore. But a lot of these moments, a lot of these tricks that went down remain in skate history forever. So that was kind of the idea behind this. So all the pieces come together, and then the staircase explode, and then we transition into this moment. And this is meant to speak to the experience of skating something big and scary. So at least for me, it's always been a bit of a process where it takes a moment before you are actually able to commit and go for it. So these stair steps have a little bit of a hesitation before they lock in, and then they form and the camera pushes through. And arguably the most famous stair set of them all, El Toro High. So when I was thinking about what I should have as a last shot, it had to be El Toro. And we have a culmination here of some spots and some elements that we've seen throughout the film. And then we animate out to the end titles and the credits and all that stuff. All right, so that was a broad overview of the project. But before we move on, I just wanted to recap with these 3 tips that I think could be useful for your own projects. And the first tip is in regards to your camera language. And we usually move the camera to follow the action to keep things framed and readable. But your camera language can be so much more than just simply following the action, right? So as an example, say that you're working on this beauty project and there's this product that is the main sort of hero in the film. Well, in this case, it might make more sense to be more minimal and more subtle with your camera moves. Or maybe you're working on a sports-related project. Well, in this case, it might make more sense to be more dynamic and dramatic with your camera moves. But maybe it turns out that this sports piece is actually about the glory of winning, perhaps. Well, then the focus should shift to that narrative instead. As you probably can tell, these things are all contextual, but I find that when the camera language is designed with the right intention, it can really help elevate a project as a whole. The second tip I have for you is in regards to lensing. And I used to think about a lens as just a way to get a nice composition or effect, or just as a way to make something look good. But I think it's useful to think about your lens choice as a perceptual thing. And we can use lensing to mimic how we experience the world as humans. So what do I mean by this? Well, your eyes aren't like a camera with a locked single lens. It's more like you have every lens at once, but your attention is what shifts the focus at any moment. As an example, say you're at a party and you find yourself in a big living room. Well, in this moment, it's probably going to feel like a wide-angle lens. And the reason why it feels that way is because your eyes are able to dart left and right and up and down. And as you scan through the living room, you might find a familiar face across the room. And all of a sudden, we're at an 85mm lens, for example. So when you choose a focal length, what you're really choosing is how you want the audience to experience the space, similar to how your own eyes and brains would. And I mean, that's a creative decision and not just a technical one, right? So maybe a wide establishing shot is exactly what a certain scene needs, but maybe it's more interesting to go more narrow and to hide information from the audience and let the audience question and discover things throughout your project. The third tip I have for you is in regards to lighting. And as 3D designers, we're already accustomed to lighting our scenes and our shots in order to make things visible, readable, and come to life. But personally, I think lighting is hands down one of the most, if not the most important storytelling tools that you have. Not only can it tell the audience where to look and how to feel, but it can also be used as a narrative device. The way something is lit or what you choose to leave in the shadows. All of those things can give meaning and purpose and can say something about the story that you're telling. And I mean, all of these things that I've talked about are powerful in their own right, but I think the real magic happens when they're used together. And these are all creative decisions that you can make on your own. So whatever you're working on, don't just use these tools to make things clear or functional. Use them to make people actually feel something. And to me, that's the part that turns a nice looking piece into something that actually resonates with me. So before we get into the Houdini stuff, I thought I'd just share some insights to what the process looked like and how I structured this project. And when starting a project, I would highly recommend that you make sure that you have a dedicated space for all your creative ideas and references. And that can be a Google Slides deck like what I have here, but it can also be a Milanote deck or whatever you have access to. So I treated this project as I would do for any client project, really, just in a more condensed manner. So here I wrote some words just for myself so that I could remember what my initial intention was and what the background behind it was. And the reason why I did this was just to be able to remember everything, because I was kind of doing this in sections between client projects. So it was just good to have this that I could always come back to and that I can always reference as I was moving through the project. And you don't have to do it exactly in the way I structured in this deck, but it's just to give you an idea on one way to think about these things. So we can move on to some of the creative stuff. And I started out by writing some thoughts on the objective, and I think this is pretty important to do just as a way to make sure that you're aligned with yourself on what this thing is that you're going to create. So in my case, that was to create a short animated film depicting everyday urban objects transforming through movement and structural change. And then from there, since my personal project had more of a visual narrative, I found it very useful to write a synopsis or like a overall outline of the story and what it's about. Depending on what you're making, you might not need to write an entire script for it, but in my case, I just found it helpful to put it down in words so that I could make sense of everything. And this isn't something that I intended to share with anyone, but not, obviously now I'm doing it, but just to give you an idea. And then I wrote a couple of thoughts in regards to the tone and how I wanted it to be expressed. So I knew that I wanted it to be slightly cinematic, but also have this intersection of it being more expressive and dynamic. I also wrote down some logic for the lighting. So the idea was to emulate natural light and lean on warmer tones for themes around creativity and innovation, and then grays and dullness for the opposites. But before I even wrote the script, I actually broke it down into 3 main story beats. And I just found that it was a little bit easier to think about it in this way, because I did try to do some storyboards, but I just found it really hard to imagine it in drawing. So in the beginning, we have this part about discovery, and then we have the barriers, and then the evolution where the creativity and the imagination occur. And after this, I started to break down these sections into finer detail. So in the beginning, I had this idea of opening the short with this lens that then would have beams of light illuminating the spots as the film progresses. But in the end, I kind of moved away from this concept as it felt a little bit too abstract, and it didn't really fit what I was trying to make. But I thought I'd leave it in here just to show you that project can change and will change throughout time, and that's okay. And you can always pick these ideas up in a different project if you want to. Then from there, we have the section about the stoppers, and this remained in the film as we've seen. And then I had to think about the last section and what that would be about, and this also largely remained as part of the story as well. I also wrote some initial ideas regarding the sound, but to be honest with you, this was a pretty difficult thing to think about because I didn't really have a good reference when I started this project in terms of sound. But I was fortunate enough to be able to team up with Zelig on this, so we bounced some ideas back and forth, and then we took it from there. And I basically just gave them the broad overview and my intention behind the project. And then they put their own spin on it. I'm super stoked about how it turned out. I couldn't be happier about it. So thank you so much to Zelig, and big shout out to them as well. Moving on to some of the more visual stuff. So I put together this mood board of the general tone that I was after. And one challenge that was pretty tricky was that this project had so many different locations and different textures and stuff. But what I decided to do was to work under the same base look. And I'll also show you a bit more on that as we'll be diving into the working files and how I glued everything together in the end. It was more as a way to align myself just to make sure that it was sort of in the same world. Then I did some research and started to gather some references. And these are a bit different from the mood boards in terms of that they are more acting as references for how I imagine the shots could behave and take shape. And as you can see, most of these references are photographs, aside from this one in the top left. I think that's like an old Man vs. Machine project. But in general, I wanted to lean into realism so that I could make sure that the majority of the spots would be recognizable. Here's a different direction that I didn't use, but that I found pretty interesting. And, I love mapping out these worlds and potential visual expressions. That's kind of what I think is the most fun. And I find that often I'll get more ideas as I pull these references in and build these things out. So that's always something that's super fun for me. Here's another one related to the innovation section. And at first I had this idea of it being a split between realism and something more graphic. But in the end, I kind of steered more into the realism aspect and let the animation and camera language drive the theme of innovation and creativity instead. So after this, I started to take a look at some environments, and I started to break it down into these different categories. So we have some schoolyards, just taking a look at what that feels like and how that could take shape, and taking a look at some plazas. So you can see some direct references here I used that ended up in the actual film. And here's another one that touches a bit more on the urban sort of gridness kind of thing. And here's some other ones of some parking lots and whatever. But in general, I treat these reference boards more as like a creative springboard rather than strict definitives. And that's kind of how I like to work, a little bit loose. And then as I go through everything, it kind of takes shape. Here's some more of some sidewalks. And from there on, I started to break these things out into different spot categories and just having a real think about like what kind of spots are there. So we have some ledges, some rails and flat bars, picnic tables. We got some banks. I did some explorations on this, I think, but it just didn't fit the overall film. But you can see like where a lot of the inspiration came from this research. And here's some more. And then from there on, I dove even deeper and took a look at some specific spot references that I thought was interesting or that I thought would fit this narrative that I had in mind. So we have some legendary skate spots here and some different references. But yeah, that was kind of how I approached the research behind this project. So moving on to some design explorations. So this is actually some of the first frames that I did. And this was pretty useful to do very early for me, just because I did have the initial idea that I wanted to do something with skate spots and how that experience is like as a skater when you first start to skate. But I wasn't sure necessarily if I could make it look the way that I imagined in my mind. So this served as a proof of concept for myself, really, to see if I could actually pull this off. And in this case, these environments actually ended up in the final film, as you've seen. Here's some early explorations on the textures for the wave, pretty close to what ended up in the final film. And here's in regards to that initial concept I had for the discovery phase. So we have this lens that was going to shoot up some beams of light, but you can see how it kind of got a bit too spacey and like outer worldly. It's strayed away a bit from that raw and like real aesthetic that I wanted. So that's why I moved away from this. But always fun to explore. And you never know where it's going to take you, really. Yeah, some more explores here, still very abstract. It just wasn't where I wanted to take this film, so that's why I abandoned it. So I had this idea of this single seed that sort of ripples out throughout the film. Did some more explores on that. Also did a little bit of slop here. Gotta try some slop. This was very early on when Midjourney was out, I think, so I just had to go with it. But yeah, none of these really spoke to me, really. I mean, it's cool, I guess, but it was just too abstract to, I don't know. It's just something about Gen AI that just doesn't really feel right. It just doesn't have any soul. I think that's the issue. It's made by a machine, doesn't have that human touch, I suppose. Either way, fun to explore. And then here are some other early frames of the category in terms of natural transitions. So I started out making these frames, but I kind of moved away from this because it just felt too much like a skate park, and I wanted it to be grounded in like actual real urban environments. But yeah, some explorations of that. So I moved into this, which is still very abstract, but it was a direct reference to a spot in real life. So that kind of hit the mark for me. And here you can see some further evolution of that, adding some leaves, taking a look at some skate stoppers, and then, yeah. And these are some early explorations on how the rails would look, essentially just some look dev of the rails. And I found that was pretty useful to do early on because these shapes are so simple and basic. So I kind of realized that the texture and the lighting was going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So that's why I made sure that, I put as much detail as I could into the textures and just try to make it feel as a real object that you would skate. And then I moved this into an environment, but again, this felt a bit too architectural, a little bit too abstract and sci-fi almost. So I took it into this environment instead. But then this felt a bit too dark and a bit too much like a Batman movie or something. I don't know. So I kind of moved away from the darkness and into more of a daytime scenario. And this is kind of where it ended up in the end. And then some explorations into the stairs. And I think if there's one thing that I would redo if I would do it all over again, is to try and hit that mark in terms of communicating this feeling of how big these objects actually feel to skate, because I think that is missed a little bit. But there's always things to improve and expand on. And then some look dev on the final stair. So I did do some explorations on like how this could evolve and animate, but I just felt that again, like the more I twisted things and the more I deformed things, you kind of lost the recognizability of it. So I kind of moved away from this world. Well, I kept some elements of it, but in the end, it kind of had to feel more like an actual staircase. And here's just some final production frames. So I'll just skip through this because we've already seen it. But you can kind of see that, the staircase, this is where that ended up as a final frame. So to wrap this up, I'm just gonna go through some of the could'ves, should'ves, and didn'ts. And the first thing is to write it down. What I mean by this is to make sure that you actually write your initial ideas down and that you have a space for this. And it can be something simple as Apple Notes or an Obsidian Vault or whatever have you. But make sure that you have an easily accessible space for this so that when ideas come, you can just drop them into a memory bank and then they're there to bring out whenever you need them. So what I like to do in the beginning is to just treat ideas as just that, an idea, and not the idea. Because I think it's really easy sometimes as well to get attached to an idea, and then it turns out as you're working through the concept and everything that it doesn't really hold up. So the enemy isn't really a bad idea, it's the vague idea that feels complete in your head, but breaks when you try to say it. So once you have all those ideas, or once you have the idea that you feel confident enough about, I think it's really useful to start from the back. And what I mean by that is to make sure that you define an objective and a purpose if you have one. So for the objective, the question you can ask yourself is, well, what is this thing that you're looking to make? And try to make this as clear and concise as possible. Maximum 2 sentences, preferably 1 if you can. And then in regards to the purpose, ask yourself, well, what does it mean to you, if any? This is something that's going to make sure that you're actually on track on what you're actually creating. When it comes to personal projects, I don't really think it necessarily needs to have a deep purpose. It could be as simple as wanting to learn something new or wanting to get into, particle simulations or get better at animation. But what I do think is it can be a really strong motivator. And in my case, writing down the synopsis is something I should have done way, way earlier, because that's something that you can actually measure against and make sure that when you're looking at the edit and everything, that it actually aligns with the story that you've already established. Sketch it out. I think this is a pretty important time saver, so fail fast, save time. Whenever you can, rely on play blasts, references, mood boards. It can be storyboards as well. With style frames, it can be a very good motivation boost, but it does take a little bit more time to build out, obviously. But make sure that you actually sketch it out first before you commit to an actual idea. It takes time. And the reason why I put this in here is because in this day and age, we have all of these social media platforms and algorithms that constantly makes it feels like we have to push things out on a daily occurrence. And sure, you can do that. That's totally fine. But I do think that it comes with a little bit of a danger in terms of making sure that the creative process is as good as it possibly can be. I think that any great work requires time, no matter what the process or the tools that you're using. I mean, sure, you can work with faster tools, better tools, but at the end of the day, the creative process still takes time, and you can try and skip it, but I don't think it's a good idea. And I also think it's important to allow yourself to spend that time without having to feel pressure from any external factors. Make it fun. And this might sound obvious, but it's something that can be a bit hard to hold on to throughout the project, because you might run into those moments where it might not feel as fun anymore. And in those cases, I tend to just steer away a little bit from the brief and allow myself to, just have fun. Make something silly, skip ahead to a more of a fun shot and revisit the shot that you're struggling with in the moment and go back to it later. Or make some Easter eggs, I don't know. The point is to make sure that you're actually designing the process to be as fun for you as possible. It's personal, so it should be fun for you to make. And when I'm having fun, I always find that time is always worth spending. Call it done. And this is something that I struggled with on this project and that I still struggle with, to be honest with you. So how do you know when a project is done? The question you should actually ask yourself is, does it do what I set out to do? And if it does, then it's considered done. I think that's a little bit more of a healthier way to approach it, because done then moves from being just a mere feeling to something more of a criteria that you can measure. Another sign that might indicate that you're actually done is when you're at the stage where you're just moving things around a little bit here and there and just tweaking things. And I think the question that I should have asked myself at those moments is, am I improving it or am I just changing it? If it's improving, then it's valid. But if I'm just changing it over and over again without any clear signs of improvement, then it should be considered done. So that was all about the process, and now when we've covered that, we'll be hopping into Houdini, where I'll go through some of the working files. So I figured we'd start with this bench shot. So this is actually 3 shots, but I did it in the same working file. And this is a question I get from time to time is, should I create a separate hip for each shot? And in general, I would say yes, and especially if you're working in a team. But in this case, it was just me working on it, so I figured I might as well just do this entire scene in one single hip. It kind of made sense to remove as much friction as possible, closing and reopening scenes here and there. So that way I could do the animation, the layout, the lighting, and all that stuff in one single file. So here I have it split up in these network boxes. I probably could have done it as like 3 different subnets, and that's something that I do sometimes as well, but in this case, I guess I didn't. And then in my render settings, I'm just excluding things here and there, depending on the names. So that's something that you can do. And then I just sent all of these to Deadline, and then it would just render on itself. So the first thing I did was actually to animate the camera and the bench. So if we go in here, we can see that here I have some of the modeling steps I did. So super simple stuff, but just going through some different modeling operations, nothing groundbreaking here really. And then I'm just copying it over, using my favorite node match size to make it align where I want it to. So we have the legs on the left side, and then we have the top on the right side. And then from there, I'm just creating some rest position here. I guess that was probably because I thought I needed it for shading. I'm not sure if I actually did in the end, but whatever. Adding some colors here, probably for shading as well, or just as a nicer representation in viewport. And then from here, once I have this model, I started to block out the different end poses. And, I'm doing this like entirely in SOP, so no kin effects or anything, because it was such a simple shape. So just some bend deformers here. So I have my 2 endpoints, and then I'm just using a simple lerp function to essentially just animate from one pose to the other. So in the end, we end up on something like this. Very simple. But with the camera, it kind of became this. So it feels a bit snappy, like it's moving from place to place. And I guess also worth mentioning is that in Houdini, you can actually switch between cameras with this switch node. If you just highlight this and plug in different cameras, you can animate when you want to switch between certain cameras. It's kind of handy. Then if we go up to the layout of things, we'll see here if it reloads. I think my viewport is a bit laggy. Yeah, I guess I need to click these. So yeah, definitely not the best way of doing things, but when I did this was made in Houdini 19, I think, or something. So things might have changed with the viewport, so that might be why it's not updating correctly. But I just used this null to turn the visibility on and off. Frankly, this would have been way easier to just do with a single subnet. So I should have just grabbed this and hit Shift-C, and that will create this subnet. So then everything would lie in here instead. And that would make it way easier to target as well for the ROP nets. I'm also grouping my lights here. So these are just the lights that I had for this particular scene. So it consists of a dome light and then just 3 area lights. So pretty simple. Let's see if we can see them. Oh, it's all the way up there. So I guess the goba light was sort of like a sun kind of light. And then I just added some fill light and a key light. And the dome light acts as kind of like an environment light as well that just fills in some of the darker areas. I can probably hit render. We'll see if it crashed or not. I was also doing this on an older version of Redshift, so things might be broken. We'll have to see. Oh, no, there you go. So yeah, that's what we have. And yeah, then in terms of set dressing and stuff, I did this in the old sort of like standard Houdini way. I didn't use Solaris for this because it was so new at the time. But if I would redo it, I would probably do it in Solaris because doing this in SOPs is kind of cumbersome. I'll just show you what that entails really. So in here, this is where I did all the layouts. And normally you should probably do this on the OBJ level because once you start merging things together, it becomes very slow to move around because this merge node has to calculate everything, I guess. So if I need to move this fence or whatever it's called, it would be very slow. So yeah, definitely not the prettiest network tree or whatever, but yeah. But one thing worth mentioning is that I used this labs tree creator or whatever it's called. It's kind of neat. So you start off, you have this control null here that you can use to add some randomization. And you can even hook this up to a topnet and get unlimited iterations of a tree. In my case, I just built 2 different ones manually and then I just copied them over. But it's pretty cool. You start out with this tree trunk generator and then you can stack them on top. And then you can create more branches, and then you have a tree. And then from there you can add some leaves. And in my case, I brought in some atlases from Quixel that gets added onto the cards of these leaves. So if I uncheck this, you can see that it's just grids. But if you pipe something in here in the 3rd input, it will take those inputs and apply them to those grids. And we can just take a look at what that looks like. So it's a lot of assets here. But I imported this with the ODFX Atlas Splitter. I've since then built my own, but back then I didn't have that, so I used OD tools. So this just creates some cards for me, and then I can just add the textures, and then that's what we have. So these will be the actual things that are getting scattered on those tree leaves. So yeah, I cleaned up some attributes, and then I just cached it out so that we have this. So these are just static, and then I have this other tree, so I'm just merging that together. Scattering some points that I sort of hand placed. Yeah, so those are the point locations, fetching the name attribute, and then I'm just copying that over. And then I have this out null here. So this is what I'll be grabbing in these separate geometry nodes here. So I can just show you. So we start with the floor. So this is just some Quixel mixer kind of texture that I made. And then we have our background objects. So these are some kitbash assets, I think. So I just brought some assets in and just placed them like that. And I think this is also like where it gets kind of important to nail your camera first, because then you can just skip everything else. You know, if you have your camera set, then you already know where things are going to be in frame. So I think that's super important to just nail your cameras first before you start doing the set dressing and all that stuff. So we have the background objects, and then we bring in the trees, and then the scatter setups. So these are just some debris. And then we have some walls, and then the last layer are all the props. So those are the layers, and I guess I can show you the scatter setup, but it's pretty simple. It's just the same stuff we've gone through and that you probably already know. But for the props, I mean, this kind of mess is kind of what I did. So I just dropped in some assets, and then I just moved them around with these transform nodes until it looked right. So this is like not that good of a workflow, I think, because it gets kind of heavy if you have like a lot of different things and a lot of geometry that this merge node needs to recook. And that's kind of where the whole Solaris workflow makes more sense, really. It's way faster and everything lives on disks as USD files. But yeah, I can just show you like how slow this actually can get. I don't know, this might be fast. If I try and move this, you can see that it is kind of lagging behind a bit. And in the beginning, it's really fast. So if I just click on this thing, now it's going to be really fast because we only have 4 objects. But the more you add up, the slower it gets. Now if I try to move this, it's kind of, yeah, it's getting slower and slower. And then here are some of the scattering setups. Nothing groundbreaking here, just scattering some points using the scatter line attribute from pieces to get the individual pieces based on this class attribute. Well, I guess the attribute is called name in this case. So that is what varies everything up. And that's also something that was kind of like tricky to do sometimes, you know, like because there's so many different pieces in like urban environments. You don't think about it, but when it's not there, you'll definitely notice that something is off. So a lot of time was just like spent on adding different scattering setups and just making sure that they're placed where it makes sense and whatnot. If we head back into the build of the bench, we also have this block here that is the FX stuff. And these are the secondary sort of like layers of animation that I added on top. So I'm just bringing in the bench and then I'm prepping my source geometry. So I'm just blasting some individual parts out, grouping them. And I guess this is what I ended up with in the end. Scattering some points, and then I'm transferring some velocity from that initial animation. And then I'm doing some velocity modifications here. Oops. Added some extra points just to get a little bit more source area and modifying the velocity even further with some curl noise. So these are the points that are getting sourced into the smoke solver. So that's what that looks like. Very simple. You can see that I'm fetching a VDB representation of the bench. So this will be a collider. And then I'm also creating a bounding box. And this is based off of a smoke solver setup from John Kuhn's. And the main idea behind this smoke solver is to let the GPU do most of the calculations on sim time. So normally you would do sort of like you'd convert your points in SOPs to a volume or a VDB, and then you would source that into the smoke solver itself. So in this case, we're just sourcing the points as is. So they have some attributes on them, density, temperature, and velocity. And then these points with those attributes gets converted into volumes with these gas particle to fields microsolvers. But the whole point being that we're letting that happen on the GPU instead of on the CPU. So in my advanced tab, I've toggled this use OpenCL toggle, and that will just make sure that we're using the graphics card for all of these calculations. And in my case, I have a RTX 4090, so I have a decent amount of VRAM. So for this amount of simulation, it was just way faster to iterate on the GPU instead of doing that on the CPU. If you want to learn more about how to set this up, I'll leave a link to one of John Kuhn's videos on that. It's a really good watch. So that will be in the description of this video. So then from there, I'm just bringing that in with the DOP import field, caching it out. So in the end, this is what we have. Converting that from a regular Houdini volume into a VDB. And now when I look at this, I probably should have cached the VDB out instead of the volume, but you know, whatever. And then I'm splitting that out. So I have the density on the left side and the velocity on the right side. And the velocity is going to drive the particle simulation. So from these same like source points, I'm just adding some more points to that with the point replicate. And I'm also using the switch node just to turn the points on and off so that it doesn't emit points on every single frame. So this is being fed into the popnet and the velocity in the second input. And the velocity gets piped into this pop advect by volumes node. You've seen it in a lot of different other tutorials, I'm sure. It's just a way to move your particles by a volume or a smoke simulation in this case. So this is the main sort of force. In this case, we are advecting the velocity themselves. So it will be a bit stronger than a force. But then I'm layering some forces on top. So I have some pop force, some pop drag, some pop wind. And yeah, everything else is just standard, really. Bringing in the ground plane, nothing special here. So in the end, we get something like this. And then I'm taking these points and I'm just copying over some Quicksil geometry. So I have these rock instances, just making sure that they're roughly the size of 1. And then we're just scattering these on top of those points. and they're very tiny, so you can barely see them, but you can kind of feel them in motion. And if we want to see everything together, this is what it looks like. So we have our smoke as one layer, we have the particles instanced as one layer, and then we have the bench. Yeah, so this is the New York side of things. So similar setup, really, just a different environment. As I'm building this out, I'm just taking a look at from this camera, taking a look at, okay, well, where's my camera? Where do I need to add foreground elements? Where do I need to add detail in the back? And you can even see here that like these buildings are probably completely unnecessary unless they might cast some shadows. I don't think so, but just making sure that you don't do like me, because all of that geometry adds to sort of like the VRAM and everything when you hit render. And then, yeah, kind of similar thing here for the Philadelphia setup. It's just a lot of different assets compiled together for merge nodes. Pretty dirty workflow here, but just to give you an idea. I have these nulls here that I'm using as a focal point for each camera. And I also built this camera rig here. I've actually made an HDA of this now. But yeah, this camera rig is kind of neat. You just have all the controls you need, really. You can circle around. You have local controls for the pans and tilts and rolls. You can also set a spline. I might release this. I don't know. We'll see. Let me know in the comments if you want this tool. And yeah, that's basically it for this shot. For the wave, the setup was a little bit more simple. So if I hit render here, see if it takes off. And I'm just going to turn off the motion blur for this one. So that's what we have. So for the wave itself, it started out as the circle, and then I'm just booleaning it against itself, offsetting this thing. So from there, we're fusing it, I'm adding some normals, and then I'm also using this exoside quad remesher to get a nicer topology. And this is a plugin, but I think in newer versions, you have the quad remesh. And I think in Houdini 22, this is going to be even better, but this is like a similar idea. Adding some bevels, adding some UVs, adding some normals, and just that regular Houdini workflow. But I think I exported a proxy, and this is what I actually rendered. But you can set up a redshift proxy output here, and then you can just save it out as a .rs proxy or whatever it's called. But before I did that, I actually just used it in the regular Houdini way. So I baked it out as a BGO, added a couple of groups here so that I could switch between a red brick and a yellow brick. So I merged these two geometries together, and then I added a variant attribute to split them out on an attribute level, adding some materials, coloring them. So we have the red one. I mean, you can't see them now because they're overlapping. These are two primitive groups. And then I created this huge grid. And on the point level, I decided which brick would be red versus which brick should be yellow. Did some initial deformation, and then I copied it over 3 times, and this is kind of inefficient, but I just had some holes otherwise underneath it. And then I'm using this wave deformer as a way to build a wave. So this was just some setup I found. I don't know exactly where I found this. Might have been on the CG wiki or something. I can't remember. So you start by defining a transform matrix, and then there's some multiplications and remapping and stuff to get this shape. So it's pretty neat. We have this fast preview here. So here we can see where the yellow bricks will end up and the red ones. So as I was play blasting this, I kind of worked in this view just to get a better sense for the speed and everything. But yeah, initializing some up vectors here to make it align properly. And then I just copied over a lot of geometry, or instanced geometry. They're packed. I also created some masks to further modify the geometry. And this I could have done with like a simple mask from attributes or whatever. But I just have this HDA here that does it for me. So I have a couple of different ones. So as it rises, I'm controlling or offsetting the position a bit. So you can see here that this is without it, this is with it. And I just felt that this added a little bit more aggressiveness to the animation. So I have 2 attributes for that. And you can see here, the other attribute is where the wave will crash. So when it crashes, I also add some randomization. And then I split this out. So I have a preview, and then I removed all of the points or all of the geometry, the packed geometry, and just left it with the points. And these are the points that I'm actually going to instance over. So this was very fast to render. And that's why I exported that proxy geometry as well. So we have the points, and then we're bringing all of that in this geometry container. So I'm fetching those points, and then I'm adding a bit more randomization, probably for shading, setting the different groups again, but on an attribute level, so that the Rs proxy would pick that up in the shader. And then I'm manually pointing that to that cached geometry or proxy. So this is what's actually going to be rendered. But then in the viewport, I was loading in the cached BGO, so that this is what we see in the viewer. But if I toggle this, you will probably see that it's just points. So that's a way you can do it if you want to split it out. In reality, though, I guess Rs proxies might have been unnecessary since it's just a single piece. But at the time, this is what I did. And then the secondary layer are these leaves that gets thrown up. So they are being made here. So the leaves are just a Quixel asset. So it's these leaves. And then, yeah, I just split it out here so that I could see the different instances. And then it's your regular kind of workflow where you're just copying them over. So yeah, I start with these points here, adding some enumeration, some ID, and then I'm doing a little bit of projection here just to make sure that they lie on top of the first layer of the bricks. And I'm also blasting out the points that I don't need from the camera's point of view. And then it's just a very simple particle simulation. So you can see here, that's what that was. And then copying over those atlases. Again, just some dedicated lights for the actual area where the camera is pointing at. And then I also had a couple of more lights that followed the camera. So I'm just referencing the animation of the deformer. So as that moves through, these lights will keep on like moving along it. For the shading, in general, importing that material attribute so that I can split between yellow and orange or red. And then mixing that color, just varying things up a little bit here and there. And this goes into the final shader, and it has some bump, and I even removed the displacement because we were so far away. But I think in some of the earlier shots, when we're more up close, I actually had a bit of displacement as well. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. So for these steps, it consists of two components, I guess. So first we have these steps that kind of animate in form. And then I also have this staircase generator that I built. And this is pretty simple as well. I mean, just starting out with steps, copying over more steps, and then I'm doing some geo things here just to shape it in the way that I wanted. So yeah, just some beveling and subdividing that, adding UVs. And then with the match size node, I'm also aligning some handrails for that. So I built that as well, just entirely procedural. So taking those same instance points and then just doing some grouping here in order to get the first and the last point. So we have the top row, and then we have the middle sections, merging it together. And then we're fusing those points, sorting it by the primitive number, and then we're joining it. And this way we can get consistent or increasing point numbers. And in this wrangle, I'm just comparing the dot or the vectors against one another in order to extract the, almost like the curvature or whatever. On these angles where they start to differ, I'll mark them as being valid for these groups. And then I'm coloring it as well. There's probably a built-in note for this, but this was just the way I did it at the time. But the reason why I do that is because I'm adding some extra points to these edges here. Because if I didn't, you can see here when after I sweep it and after I subdivide it, if I don't do that, you'll see that we get this smoothing that I didn't like. So I just wanted to sharpen that edge a little bit. So that was the reason behind that. And I'm grouping that and putting that together, just copying it over manually. And we get something like this. And I also created this plateau, and it's just a grid or a box. But together it becomes this, and then I'm just copying it over and over. And we also have the rails here because I think I split it out differently because the stairs had a little bit of displacement. I didn't need that for the rails. So that's what that is. And then I just copied it over a couple of times. Pretty inefficient here, just copying over actual geometry. Would have been faster to just instance it, but I was in a rush, so I just wanted to get something working. And then in regards to the steps, we can take a look here. So we're just starting out with this circle. And this circle is going to be where the actual points or the copies of these steps will align. So we have the circle. I'm creating a couple of masks here. So these will just control the timing of the animation. And I made an entire video about this and how to set this up. So you can check that out if you want. But altogether, it's just a couple of masks to control the timing. Also creating the base step here, subdividing it, beveling it a little bit. And then I'm creating this rest pose here. That is the starting point of the animation. And I'm also creating the same rest pose, but just remeshed and a little bit lighter. So I just brought in the step, the simple step without subdivision, remeshed it. And then I copied it over so that it had the same starting position. And this will be what is actually going to be simmed. But before that, I also did some different end states. So the idea was that I'd start the animation in this state, and then we have a couple of targets that I can try and sort of aim towards. And this would be the final state. And once I had that, then I could just hop into Vellum. So I did some enumeration here. And I did this because I think Vellum uses the ID for a different purpose. I'm not entirely sure, but I just had some issues relying on the ID. So I created my own custom index based on the point number. And then I'm adding some constraints here. So I use the shape match constraint that comes with Vellum. So it's a bit more rigid. Could have done this in an RBD sim as well, but at the time I was just way more comfortable using Vellum, so I just stuck with that. And when it comes to constraints in RBD, I also forget how it works. So Vellum is just points in space, or at least that's how I think about it. And then you can just push the positions in space rather than have to deal with rotations explicitly. So if we hop into the solver, it's just a simple Vellum solver, but with a wrangle. I'm recording the positions of these target positions. And then all I'm doing really is just pushing those positions towards their goal using the velocity attribute. And then I also have a little helper here so that I can see when things get moved close enough to a certain target position. And this is driven by those masks or those factor attributes that I defined up here on the circle. So what we get is something like this. And then I'm taking this result and point deforming the actual geometry that I'm going to render. So that was the main simulation. And here I have a toggle so I can flip between the low-res version and the high-res version. But from there, I just cleaned it up a little bit, removed the colors, added some UVs or transformed the UVs. And then I'm offsetting the UVs per step. So I don't know if you can see that, but if I uncheck this, you can see that they perfectly align and they're exactly the same. So that was just a cheap way to add a little bit more variation on the shader level. And then I keyframed some bits on top of everything. And this way I got the final look that I wanted. That was a bit less rigid, or felt less rigid. This way I just had a little bit more control over everything. So the final thing was something like this. I can just show it in the fast mode. So in motion, it would look something like this. And in terms of shading, I don't know if I should go through this, but it's just a bunch of materials blending here and there, adding variation where necessary, switching up the color a little bit step by step, things like that, just to make it a little bit less uniform and unified. And then lighting, I have a key light, I have a top light, fill light, so they're placed. I can show you how I placed them. Yeah, I have a global light as well, just to break up the lighting pattern a bit. And then I have the main lights that are sort of focusing on the hero object, and the dome light that just fills in the darker spaces. You can see here that I have this gradient background, and this was something that I just toggled on as I was rendering, just to make sure that, like, is this gonna look right? But in the end, I actually rendered it on alpha, and then I re-added the background in post instead. So I thought I'd give a brief overview of how I approach the post-processing or like the comp side of things. And to be honest, there wasn't too much comp. I was just working over the beauty, and then I had a cryptomat that I could use as a way to bring out certain elements. So I did all of this in After Effects, and After Effects by default I think manages a lot of the colors for you. So what I usually do is I go to all my sequences and then I just check this preserve RGB checkbox just to make sure that After Effects isn't adding any color adjustments or color transformation on top. And then I also tend to go up to project settings, and then I just switch this to Adobe Color Managed, but I set the working color space to none so that it doesn't do anything to my image. You've probably seen other people use OCIO color manage workflow, which is actually what I'm doing, but not on the project level. I do it comp per comp because sometimes I might have logos or things that aren't in the ACES color space that I need to add into my final image. So it's just easier to work with adjustment layers and convert it using that method instead of doing it project-wide. So because I needed a way to glue all of these shots together, I made the decision to work under a film print emulation LUT. So you can see that here. And a LUT stands for lookup table. And if you don't know what that is, you can think of it as a recipe for changing colors. So you feed the colors in and it tells every pixel what color to become. And it doesn't add anything, it just remaps the colors already there. And a film emulation LUT is a recipe built to make digital footage look like it was shot on actual film. And this is measured from actual film stocks. So you can see here that I have some different ones. And these are all from Juan Melara. So I'll leave a link to that in the description of this video. They're free to download. And what's worth knowing is that LUT started as a technical tool actually, and not a creative one. Although these days they're arguably used way more for creative purposes. But back in the days when post-production went digital, artists needed a way to preview what a film would actually look like once it got printed. So the film would be scanned into a computer, and then a digital colorist would color it there, and then they would print it back onto film. And the LUT was a preview, just as a way to show them on the screen what it would look like once it hit real film again. So that's a little bit of a history lesson. But the thing worth noting here is that these LUTs expect the footage to be in log space. So that's the reason why I converted from ACCG into RE log C. And I could have picked, I think there's like a dedicated log space here as well, but I just found that this LUT responded a little bit better to log C. So I guess we can just go through the entire stack. So this is the render raw from Houdini, but without any display transform. So this is obviously not what I would see when I would light this. But if I duplicate this Open Color AO adjustment and switch it to Rec 709, so this is what I was seeing when I was actually lighting and rendering it. But in my case, as I mentioned, I converted it into log C, and then I did all of my adjustments in between the log state and the film LUT. The first thing I tend to do is to add my exposure adjustment, and on this shot I actually didn't do any exposure adjustment other than darkening it in the beginning, because the lighting goes from this more dim state to this brighter state. Then I like to add some contrasts, so this does a lot of change to the image. And then after that, I usually do like a balance adjustment if it needs it. In this case, I don't think it needed it, so I didn't touch that. And from there, I added a bit of saturation just to make the trees and the grass pop a bit in the back. And then I applied my primary grade, so this pushed it more into that orange teal kind of zone, removing some of those magenta midtones and just pushing it into something a little bit more warmer. I just felt that felt a little bit more cinematic. And this is also just made with a Lumetri color adjustment. And I could have used a curves adjustment for this as well, but I just find that it's a little bit more easy to fine tune things with the color wheels rather than pulling curves. So for contrast adjustments, I tend to do it with the curves, but for actually adding or like subtracting or splitting colors, I just found it intuitive to use color wheels instead. So this is a free or like an included plugin in After Effects. Then from there, I added a slight chromatic aberration to the edges, and it's so subtle so you can't even see it unless you zoom in. But you can see that we get some color fringing here, and that's also just as a way to break up the digital pattern a bit and just make it feel a bit more like it was shot on like an actual lens. From there on, I add some glow, but in this case, I guess the glow just acts as a sort of like an exposure adjustment on top of everything. And then using this crypto matte, I added another adjustment layer set to Luma referencing that. And that was just as a way to brighten these leaves up a little bit. I just felt that they were super black. So I raised that up. And then in the end, I added another slight contrast adjustment. And then we have our LUT. And after that, I'm doing a little bit of vignetting. So just a simple mask, very feathered. And then I just brought down the exposure and shaped it a bit with the curves adjustment again. After that, I added some film grain. And it's also very subtle. You can't even see it unless you're in this dark shadow, I think. So you can see here's it off on. And it just helps break up some of that digital crispiness and make it feel a little bit more like it was shot on actual film. But yeah, in general, not much comp, just some slight exposure, contrast, and color adjustments, and some very subtle effects. And this is how I treated all of the shots using the same structure. So I always started by converting it into the log C, and then I would do my individual shot adjustments under the film emulation LUT. Okay, that's a wrap. I know this was a bit of a longer video, but I hope you're walking away with at least a couple of tips that you can use on your own. And please don't feel like you need to create the project as extensive as what I've shown today. I think even a small project is worth building. So pick an idea, get started, and I'd love to see where you take it. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more. My name is Joachim, and I'll see you on the next one.